Good morning. The Joint Select Committee will come to order. Welcome to the third public hearing of the Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations Process Reform. The most important role given to Congress under Article 1 of the Constitution is the power of the purse. Our panel is charged with ensuring we can fulfill this fundamental and essential duty. Long before we began our work, there was bipartisan agreement that the current process for completing this basic function of government needs substantial improvement. And during our hearing so far, we've identified some of the main challenges with the current budget process. Today's discussion will be more focused on the opening piece in the process, the annual budget resolution. As designated by the 1974 Budget Act, the budget resolution was intended to help Congress govern effectively. Unfortunately, the budget resolution as we know it today is often associated with government dysfunction and consistently missed statutory deadlines. There even seems to be some confusion from members in both chambers on both sides of the aisle about the value of even doing a budget resolution each year. That's regrettable. This apathy was clearly exemplified just 2 weeks ago in the House Budget Committee during our Members' Day hearing, a required forum and formal opportunity for members to present their budget ideas for fiscal 19. Aside from members of the Budget Committee, that forum was utilized by one member. While I was disappointed by the lack of participation, it was a sobering illustration of the budget's need for our Select Committee to succeed. During today's conversation, I am hopeful that we can start determining ways to make the budget more useful to members of Congress and encourage engagement in the process. I also look forward to talking about ways to make the budget resolution more realistic as a governing document, ensuring that it can be effectively enforced. Even though today is about the budget resolution, we cannot ignore the fact that the appropriations process is inextricably linked. The sooner that a budget resolution is passed in final form, the less likely Congress will have to rely on an omnibus or a continuing resolution. However, as both an appropriator and as chairman of the House Budget Committee, I recognize that we must be honest and ask ourselves whether the modern Congress will ever be able to successfully process 12 individual appropriation bills in a single year. This morning, to add to our conversations on this important topic, we welcome several experts who have studied the budget and appropriations process extensively. Joining us for today's discussion, we have the President of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, MacGuineas. Jim Capretta is here from the American Enterprise Institute, where he serves as a resident fellow and the Milton Friedman Chair. Jim brings a wealth of experience from his time at OMB and as a Senate Budget Committee staffer. Bill Dauster also joins us today, bringing his unique perspective as a 30-year Senate staffer and the author of a book on budget process law. Finally, offering an outside academic's view, we have Joseph White, a political science professor from Case Western University. Thank you, and with that, I'd yield to the distinguished co-chair, the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Lowy, for her opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this hearing on the subject of budget resolutions, their content, timeliness, and enforcement. Once again, we have a very good group of witnesses. We have Bill Dauster, who has formerly served as staff director and chief counsel of the Senate Budget Committee and in several other senior staff positions in the Senate and the White House. We have Professor Joe White from Case Western Reserve University, who throughout his long career has written, thought, and taught about federal budget policy and politics, as well as about healthcare policy. And further, the committee will hear from two other distinguished budget experts, Maya MacGuineas of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and James Capretta of the American Enterprise Institute. I want to thank you all for coming. I look forward to an interesting hearing, and I'm sure you'll share with us some very important information on which perhaps we can come up with some suggestions for change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy. I'd like to now welcome our witnesses. Thank you for your time today, all of you. The committee's received your written statements. They will be made part of the formal hearing record, and each will have 5 minutes to deliver oral opening remarks. And Ms. MacGuineas, we are going to begin with you. It's an honor to have you, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me here today. I'm really honored to be talking with the committee and appreciate all of you serving on it. And what's been great is it seems like you're off to a very strong start, so that's very encouraging. In our written testimony, we offered 26 different recommendations, which fall into 5 different budget areas for improvement. These things range from changing the budget calendar to standardizing baselines to making it more difficult to waive pay-go. What I'd like to do in my couple minutes of remarks here is focus on 3 areas, and I'm happy to discuss any of the others we submitted as well. And those 3 include the importance of getting something done, the importance of this committee succeeding at getting something done. Number 2, ending crisis-driven budgeting. And number 3, developing a process, a neutral process that makes it easier to agree to sound, sustainable budgets. So to start with, it's clear that the budget is no longer a statement of the nation's principles or a reflection of a strategic national plan. When the budget even does exist, it tends to be political statements filled with wishful thinking, and it puts all of you as our leaders in the counterproductive position of getting sucked into the partisan battle instead of thoughtful policymaking. This committee is not going to be able to fix how broken our politics are right now or the extent of our broken fiscal situation facing the country, but getting something done that both sides see as fair would be helpful as serving as a way to reboot the whole process, and we'll start with a new commitment to actually following the reasonable budget rules. The types of changes could include things you've heard a lot about from other witnesses before, from biennial budgeting, changing the fiscal year, using the Fiscal State of the Nation report, which Congressman Kilmer and Renacci and Convergence and others have all talked about, changing the makeup of the budget committees. But little steps can lead to bigger steps. Second, one of the main problems that I assume you want to solve is the threats of defaults and government shutdowns and how they create dangerous situations in crisis-driven budgeting. So we encourage the committee to address these landmines by, 1, reforming the debt ceiling, by requiring votes to lift the debt ceiling along with the votes for policies that would actually increase the debt. So for instance, this would have required a debt ceiling vote along with the debt increases that went along with the recent tax cut and spending bills. If you have to recognize the effects of the debt directly, it would create at least more accountability and transparency, and perhaps it would give lawmakers pause before adding to the debt. Another one of the ideas that we support is auto CRs, or an expedited procedures to adopt short-term CRs to avoid shutdowns, with the understanding that you don't actually want to be encouraging the use of CRs as a way to budget. Finally, we'd also encourage allowing more options for bipartisan deficit-reducing bills to be considered, which would encourage alternative budgets and our consideration of broadly supported legislation. I've been interested in what Senator Whitehouse has been talking about on this topic and others, but I think it's really important to create the incentives for the things that we want to get done, bipartisanship, and the things that are harder to get done, deficit reduction. So finally, perhaps the most important thing you could do is improve the process to encourage consideration of serious fiscal plans to improve our debt situation. No amount of calendar changing, baseline improving, auto CRing will be sufficient to accomplish a serious fiscal plan, and the political will to enact that. So while we all recognize that budgeting is about trade-offs and hard choices, one merely needs to look at the current fiscal situation of upcoming trillion-dollar deficits, projections of unprecedented debt levels, and interest being the fastest growing part of the budget to know that this isn't happening in our current budget. And the potential damage could harm our country for decades. So to address this, we support the adoption of a system of establishing medium-term debt target along with new enforcement mechanisms. And in 2010, our board of experts came up with an idea called a Debt Stabilization Act, whereby there'd be a medium-term debt to GDP target, annual targets to create a glide path to get there, and the budget resolution would comply with those targets, and both spending caps and pay-go would be in place. There would also be an additional trigger mechanism, and I emphasize that my board thought it was really important that trigger mechanism be half revenues, half broad-based spending cuts to really have both sides object to it and it be a mechanism that would help have budgets comply with those targets. There are a number of ways to structure these different targets. At the time, we were shooting for a debt to GDP ratio of 60% by 2018. So we're going to have to wiggle room that a little bit, not quite on track for that. But there are a lot of different ways to make this mechanism work. We'd be delighted to work with people figuring out that structure. But frankly, just moving to a process that includes a fiscal goal as part of the budget process would be a significant improvement from what we currently have. And the time to do this is right because the economy is strong at the same time that the fiscal situation is precarious. And bipartisanship, which we desperately need, is at a low, but you have the start of a really good working environment here. So lastly, whatever you do, we encourage you to add to your new process stronger enforcement mechanisms. Because right now, if you look at how we try to enforce the budget with spending caps and pay-go, the holes in that are so large, it really results in them being meaningless. And a budget process that is meaningless undermines the entire faith in our system to do the most important thing that there is for the country, which is set the thought-out plan for where we want to go. So again, thank you so much for having me here today. We have a number of recommendations we're pleased to share with you.
Thank you, Ms. MacGuineas. Mr. Capretta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you also to Ms. Lowy. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me to participate. I agree that the work of this joint committee is very, very important, very timely, and so I really am pleased that the Congress created this committee and asked you to take a look at these very difficult questions. The federal government is running very large annual deficits, and those deficits will grow in the future as the U.S. population ages and health spending continues to grow more rapidly than the economy. The current federal budget process is not helping Congress grapple with this fundamental challenge. Also, it does not facilitate an orderly and timely decision-making process. Congress wastes too much time on small and irrelevant matters, even as it fails to focus much attention on the issues of real budgetary consequence. There are many aspects that need to change. Today we're focused on the budget resolution. I'm going to make just 3 recommendations here, although I agree that many more things need to be done beyond the 3 I'm talking about today. First, I think the budget resolution should become the vehicle for establishing and amending the statutory caps on discretionary spending. Second, the budget resolution should become the vehicle by which an automatic increase in the debt limit occurs. And third, and most importantly, the budget resolution should be modified so that it includes a medium and long-term outlook. So to the first recommendation on the caps. Obviously, under the Constitution, establishing budgetary policy is a shared responsibility between the executive and legislative branches. This is part of our our constitutional structure, which is very important, of course, but one consequence is that we rarely have a budget that is enforced in total across the executive and legislative branches. Something of an exception to this are the caps, which have been in place since 1990, more or less, with a couple of exceptions. These caps, while very much a part of the process today, are not part of the regular budget process in the Congressional Budget Act. They've been enacted on an ad hoc basis. I think the Congressional Budget Resolution should become the vehicle for establishing and amending those caps. Allowing the budget resolution to become the vehicle for this would make the budget resolution a much more serious legislative vehicle than it is today. It would also bring the executive branch into budget negotiations with the Congress earlier in the year, which might help prevent the kind of end-of-year political standoffs that now regularly occur. There are a number of ways that this could be done. I think the most straightforward is that as a budget resolution made it through a final resolution made it both through the House and the Senate, it would automatically trigger the sending of new legislation to the President for his signature or veto, changing the caps in statute to comply with whatever is in the budget resolution. The President, of course, could either veto or sign it. If he vetoed it, then the Congress could try to override, and if not overridden, the caps would still apply, at least in a budget resolution sense, to the Congress. The second recommendation is to get rid of the debt limit. I think the debt limit has outlived its usefulness. Congress should get rid of it altogether because it really is a self-inflicted wound if we fail to pay our creditors. But if we can't do that, the budget resolution should become the vehicle for automatically raising the debt limit consistent with the budget levels in the budget resolution. This, too, would make the budget resolution a much more serious legislative vehicle. It would make it meaningful as a vote because this would be the vote that would trigger the debt limit being raised or not, and it would bring the executive branch also into the negotiations because of the legal questions associated with the debt limit. Lastly, and most importantly, again, bringing a long-term outlook to the budget resolution. You can see the importance of a long-term outlook by looking backwards. If we had, as a country, made changes in the mid-1990s, as was recommended by 2 bipartisan panels on budget outcomes and reforms, if we had made those changes 25 years ago, we'd be in much better shape today than we are. Similarly, we have to start making decisions now that affect the fiscal outlook of the country in 2030 and 2035. It takes that long to get some of these things right. And so I know that's a difficult task to ask people who are here to represent the here and now and what's going on in the lives of their constituents now, but attending to that situation is absolutely critical, and the budget resolution really doesn't facilitate that today. So my testimony covers this in more detail, but one simple way to do this is to bring into the budget resolution an agreed upon measure of the federal government's fiscal outlook going out the next 3 decades, such as a present value calculation of expected revenue and expected spending, make that a target for reduction over time, and use something like the reconciliation process to bring progress on meeting that goal. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Dauster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair Lowy, members of the committee, thanks for letting me be here today. Let me start by acknowledging the dirty little secret. Okay, maybe it's not so secret. A lot of members hate the budget process. I'm here to tell you it's okay to hate the budget process. It's frustrating, it gets you blamed for failure that you did not cause, and it's full of unnecessary drama. But there are 5 things, probably more than that, but I'll talk about 5 things that you can do that'll help us hate the budget process less. First, don't make it worse. Take the Hippocratic oath of budget reform. First, do no harm. Don't set yourself up for more frustration and failure. Don't create a system that punishes you when leadership fails to do its job. A good budget process should be like your favorite car. It gets you where you want to go. It doesn't force you to go where you don't want to go. Chairman Womack was right when he said that a good process is not in the business of prescribing specific budget outcomes. A bad budget process is sort of like an overambitious New Year's resolution. You know, those promises that would be nice, but we just can't keep. By February, we're denying we ever made them. Graham Rudman was like that, and I'd argue the unrealistic budget control caps were as well. So I'd say make changes that are like your favorite car and not like a New Year's resolution. Second, we should, to use Senator Bennett's term, de-weaponize the debt limit. Senator Whitehouse is exactly right when he said that it's like a bear trap in your bedroom. Many Republicans and Democrats alike agree that now may be a time to end this drama. The Gephardt rule, which automatically changed the debt limit when you adopted a budget resolution, should be applied in both houses. And if that fails, there's the McConnell rule. That's the rule that you delegate power to the president to suspend the debt limit for a period of time, subject to a fast-track resolution of disapproval. Third, a lot of senators hate the budget process and the budget resolution in particular because of vote-a-rama, the all-night vote marathon on amendments that no one has seen before. None of us have liked pulling all-nighters since college. And if we admit it, we didn't like it in college either. One problem is that the vote-a-rama is one way that the minority can get its voice heard. But you can solve that by guaranteeing that the minority leader gets a vote on a certain number of amendments. You can haggle over the number, but it's got to be something less than 50. After a certain number, the press stops paying attention anyway, so why torture yourself? Fourth, I like the Convergence Center idea to facilitate a budget action plan at the beginning of new Congress. The election cycle is the cycle that Congress pays attention to anyway, so you should recognize that reality in the process. But I also agree with Chair Lowy, and I would not move to a 2-year appropriations bill. Annual appropriations bills are one of the few ways you guys have to get the secretary of such and such to answer your telephone call. Fifth, I like the Convergence Center's idea to make the chairs and ranking members of other committees members of the budget committees, and for many of the same reasons that Senator Perdue has expressed here. As spots open up on the budget committees, give the other chairs and rankers a right of first refusal to join you on the budget committee. If enough do, it would become a place where deals get done. There's 5 suggestions. Good luck and Godspeed in your efforts.
Thank you, sir. Mr. White.
Okay, I hope I'm doing this correctly. Distinguished co-chairs and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to share some analysis and ideas with you as you search for useful ways to reform the congressional budget process, doing no harm along the way. Many of the sources of complaint about current budgeting and budget resolutions in particular, such as failure to meet deadlines or complete parts of the procedure at all, are due mainly to the intense political conflict of our time, and new processes can't fix that. But I think a bit of good can be done, and it is encouraging to see that there is some agreement among the participants in this panel, the careful statements by the committee leadership, and other efforts such as the Convergence Project. On one issue I didn't address in my written testimony, I'd just like to say that I agree with Mr. Capretta, Mr. Dauster, and the Convergence Project that it's time to eliminate the ways that the debt ceiling encourages hostage-taking and brinksmanship, full stop. Any further reforms, well, if you could do that one, that'd be a huge one, but any reform that will be designed to accomplish some set of goals, and so to meet some standards. And these standards should not consist only of beliefs about effects on budget totals, as so much discussion seems to think. So I'd like to emphasize 4 others. First, budgets should serve representative government or democratic accountability. They should make it easier for citizens to see what the government is planning and promising and delivering. And they should be affected by elections. Second, budget processes should help policymakers encourage efficient operation of government programs. Third, federal budget decisions have some effects on the national economy, so the process should encourage debate and attempts to influence those effects. Most important, the basic task of budgeting is to relate preferences about details to preferences about totals. Normal budgeting proceeds in iterations. Totals and details are proposed. If there's mismatches, those are identified, and negotiations search for a combination that is acceptable. The details, such as what is done for national security, or who pays how much tax, or what health care the government guarantees for what cost, are in aggregate at least as important as the economic effects of budget totals. Top-down approaches that set totals without first considering the effects on details, therefore, are fundamentally bad budgeting. So by these standards, I'd say there should be budget resolutions because resolutions provide a public statement of economic policy based on the governing group's beliefs about the effects of spending, revenues, and their balance. Resolutions also can trigger reconciliations, significant changes in government priorities. But these kinds of broad policies, broad priorities or basic economic approach, basically reflect elections. They are unlikely to change between elections. And by that logic, resolutions should be biennial, functioning as the U.S. version of what OECD calls a medium-term budget framework. There's no need to do resolutions twice in a Congress. The annual appropriations process, however, provides a review of agency plans that is useful both for encouraging efficiency and making agencies accountable to Congress and the public. Agency activities involve details that can change from year to year, and there are good reasons why most organizations budget in this sense annually. So I would like to see resolutions passed biennially, but set 302A allocations for the appropriations for 2 years with the appropriations remaining annual. I think that fits the purposes of both processes. Now, other witnesses have agreed with some of these recommendations, and there will be a lot more disagreement over my third point. You are receiving today, and will surely receive, more recommendations that the budget process be focused on estimated consequences for budget totals even further in the future than the current 10-year terms of resolutions. I try to explain in my written testimony why that is not a great idea, but there are just a few points here. One, long-term discretionary spending targets fundamentally ignore details. That is why they eventually break down, because you don't really believe in the details that would fit those targets. Two, procedures that claim to budget for the long run are just as subject to manipulation and gimmicks as any other procedures, as you must know from experience with evading the BCA discretionary caps. Three, the dominant factor in projected long-term spending increases is healthcare programs, but there is no good way to estimate their costs, and I provide a chart as an example of that in my testimony. In fact, focusing on long-term Medicare costs misses the point that we have a national healthcare cost crisis now, and not just in government programs. Much more could be said about this topic, but perhaps we can engage about that in the discussion period. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. White. We appreciate the testimony of each of our witnesses here this morning. I'll begin the Q&A with a question for Ms. MacGuineas. Your testimony contains a lot of solid suggestions for Congress to more effectively address long-term debt. In the current budget process, we definitely have, at best, some tension, if not an outright conflict between budgeting for the short term, that leads to an annual appropriations process, and then doing something that addresses the long term without it becoming just some fictitious goal in mind that really doesn't carry a lot of merit. Which, if any, of the elements in our current budget process, Ms. MacGuineas, would you keep?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I think I would shift a lot of the focus onto thinking about the budget more comprehensively. One of the things I don't want to do is sacrifice the long term just to focus on the short term, or vice versa. And so I think I would go to the very root of what budgets are for, which is for trade-offs, and they admit that they have constraints. And I would hold yourselves responsible for looking at what the glide path for the current projections are on a regular basis. Many times I've actually heard members of Congress say, you know, there's 2/3 of the budget that we can't even look at. And of course we can. It's not through the appropriations process, but you're responsible for overseeing the portion of mandatory spending and revenues. So what I would do is I would add in a piece that requires reviews of that, and I would increase more transparency as you figure out how to do the really hard pieces of making changes so those have alignment, which they currently don't.
We've had a lot of discussion in previous hearings about carrots and sticks. What can we do to motivate, incentivize, coerce, shame Congress into actually doing something?
So I think there's a couple things that you want to create the carrots and/or sticks for. One, of course, is getting a budget done, and the second is for improved fiscal outcomes. On getting the budget done, I do find myself kind of liking the simple idea of you shouldn't leave, you shouldn't have a recess until the budget is completed. I know people want carrots, so I figured we could just make that a carrot instead of a stick, which you get recess when you've done the budget. So we can just flip it. But I do think in terms of the long term, there are a lot of things you can do with the debt ceiling, where you get rid, or what if you replace that with a different form of budget constraint, something that only comes into play when your spending and revenue programs in the longer term are out of whack. So you would not have to have debt targets, debt ceilings, other kinds of constraints, unless they're there to remind you that changes need to be made. And avoiding them, I assume, would be a carrot.
Mr. Capretta, some observers have noted the challenge of focusing on medium and long-term fiscal outlooks, but at the same time, the unfunded liabilities of the federal government, depending on who you ask, are at least in the tens of trillions, if not into the hundreds of trillions of dollars. So help me understand why, in spite of the challenges, Congress should attempt to build in a longer-term focus as part of the budget resolution and do so in a politically neutral way.
Well, it's quite true that projecting out federal outcomes 15, 20, 30, 40 years from now is very difficult to do. But there's little question that the population aging of this country, plus the commitments that have been made in programs relative to the revenue base, has left the country with a very, very large gap. And, you know, we can argue about degrees and how much, but it's going to be very, very significant. I'd also note that many other countries have adopted some kind of a long-term focus because they understand this problem. Many countries, frankly, advanced economies, have taken much more proactive steps than we have to try to get this under control in advance of it occurring, because it's, for them, maybe accelerated some because of their demographic questions. So there's no question that we have a big unfunded liability problem. How are we going to deal with it? If we don't make some changes in the processes that are pushing the Congress to address it and the President to address it, there's very little reason to do anything. The Congress could drift on for another 10 or 15 years without anybody even really realizing how big the problem is and how until it's almost on top of us. And so I think much more focus needs to be brought to Congress on how big it is and what needs to be done now to try to affect outcomes in 10 and 15 and 20 years. You cannot change this problem with a small, adjustment and, turn around and expect it to, be implemented right away. You're going to have to do big things, and that means, things that are going to take a long time to phase in.
I'm about out of time. I was going to share some of my New Year's resolutions with Mr. Dauster, but since I've broken all of them anyway, we'll just save that for another day.
I broke mine as well.
I do like the comparison, though, to our business and breaking New Year's resolutions.
Thank you, sir.
Ms. Lowy.
For whoever cares to respond, regarding budget resolutions. In the past, the budget resolution has been a powerful tool for creating, implementing, and enforcing budget plans. But that only works if there really is actual agreement on a plan. And recently, budget resolutions seem to becoming more vague with little real purpose other than to launch reconciliation bills, and sometimes attempt to show declining deficits on paper. Would any of you like to comment on how budget resolutions can be made more real again?
Well, I'll start by saying that I do agree with the Convergence Center idea that it makes sense to set those overall appropriations levels early on in a Congress. And I try to encourage that to happen by making it sort of a disappearing fast track. You get the fast track if you can do that at the beginning of the Congress when it's useful to the appropriators, but you lose that, say, in April or May of the first year. If you don't do it by then, you don't get the fast track reward that you would have otherwise.
I would also just suggest that the recommendation I made in my testimony that said that you should tie the statutory caps on discretionary spending, on appropriated spending, to the levels that are in a budget resolution, and send legislation to the president for signature or veto on those caps. It would make the budget resolution the vehicle by which the annual appropriation caps are set for both the Congress and the president. That would be a real legislative item, and it wouldn't be fictitious. If it was signed, that would be, everybody would be signing on, subject to loopholes and trying to get around it through some practices that need to be stopped. But, caps on discretionary spending have generally, not always, but generally worked over the last 25 years. And if you put them into the budget resolution becomes more real for both the Congress and the president.
I would point out that reconciliation is an incredibly powerful tool. And I think that it should be changed back to the original intent, so reconciliation can be used for things that improve the deficit situation, not used in other ways. And I also think that budgets should be pushed back to where they are taken seriously, and they are meant to be serious, and not just political documents where the numbers don't add up. And ways to consider doing that is that if you have savings in your budget, you need to put them into reconciliation. So you need to direct for them to have reconciliation to move those savings along so that they aren't just put there on paper and never used. And ending the amount of gimmicks that we have in these budgets. So there are heroic assumptions, there's timing changes, there's all sorts of spending that's assumed to bypass the caps, but plugging up those gimmicks would be one important tool in showing that budgets need to be taken seriously, and they're at the point now where they aren't at all.
If I may, just a few points. Microphone. If I may, just a few points. One is that the original purpose of the reconciliation process in the original budget resolution was not simply to reduce deficits. There was disagreement about that. I'm not saying that at this point, given the current situation, I wouldn't support that. But sometimes, for example, you want an expansive fiscal policy, or you might want an expansive fiscal policy. And one of the original ideas was that reconciliation could be used for that. So we shouldn't talk about original intent here. I think the most ridiculous thing that's being done with reconciliations right now is the use of these $1 billion reconciliation instructions, which are ways to basically get around the Senate filibuster without actually having any fiscal policy or any policy involved. And so if there's a way to ban these $1 billion reconciliations, I think that would be a good idea. The other thing I'd like to emphasize is that it sounds nice to say that there should be agreement between that the president should sign off on the budget resolution, but the budget resolution process was originally created in part because, President Nixon and the Congress at the time did not agree on basic fiscal policy. I have a hard time imagining what the budget resolution produced by Speaker Ryan would have been that President Obama would have signed. And so I think it probably is better to view the budget resolution as something for Congress. Getting the House and Senate to agree is tough enough.
I misunderstood. I thought in your last response you were suggesting that the president get involved. I guess I misunderstood. I can't imagine bringing the president into the budget process. Now, we have enough trouble when we finish our work, but that's not here nor there. Did I misunderstand you? It seems your first
No,
comment-
no, no. I think it's very optimistic to recommend, as the Convergence Project does, and as other people have, that the budget resolution be some sort of joint resolution that the president signs. I think that's going to be very, very tough.
Oh, we agree that it would be very, 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 very
Yeah,
tough.
it'd be great if you could get agreement, but I'm not sure you can have a process that forces that.
Okay, I just want to be sure I
Yeah.
didn't misunderstand.
Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Representative Arrington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must say I find this panel so far the most helpful and most practical and most specific in getting at what I hope we can all agree to with specific strategies for a more timely, orderly process. And if we can be aspirational, I'd like to get at some ways to improve getting to better outcomes, not necessarily in a policy-neutral way. I think, let me start with the reconciliation process because it's come up. And what are ways, you say we shouldn't use the reconciliation for these billion-dollar, and I agree, actually. I mean, I voted for the tax reform because I think we've got to grow the economy, and I think that's part of it, and I think we're going to more than cover the costs there. But regardless, I don't think that that's necessarily the intent or a good pattern to enter into. Why don't we use reconciliation for its intended purpose? And I'll open that up to any of you. Why don't we use that for its intended purpose more often, given that we're $21 trillion and counting?
I think of the reconciliation bill from the Senate standpoint. And from a Senate perspective, reconciliation is a way to get a majority vote on something when the normal rule in the Senate is that you need 60 votes to go to the bathroom. But so it could be used for a lot more things than it is. But in the end, it ends, as you've said in earlier committee hearings, it often relies on the political will that isn't there to put together the costly, difficult things that you would have to put in the reconciliation.
So if that's the way to get at the 70% of the spend that we know is one part of the equation here to reduce deficit spending and debt, why and if we know that there are some really big programs within the mandatory side, why don't we use that reconciliation more often, Ms. MacGuineas?
Well, I think the problem is that what happens is to use that reconciliation usually means it's going to be one party that uses it. It's bypassing the 60 in the Senate. And for big fiscal improvements, you're going to need both parties to buy in. There is no way that we're going to get real deals, real progress, real improvements with one party owning all the hard choices.
Yeah, we couldn't even get the Republican Party on a simple majority to agree to $204 billion reduction using reconciliation during the tax reform. I don't know how in the world we're going to get, I mean, we have people in my party that won't even mention the word Social Security or Medicare when it comes to reconciliation. I mean, there are all kind of ways to say it to avoid people thinking you're trying to take their Social Security, you know, making it more sustainable for my generation and all that. But I mean, isn't it always going to come back to, will we have the guts to actually take on some things that we know are going to send us into oblivion to the debt crisis that will wreak havoc on generations to come, blah, blah, blah? I mean, please.
Well, if I could just say one thing about reconciliation, which I think has been lost over the years, which is that it was quite true that it's used mainly to get a majority vote in the Senate these days, but in the 80s, because there was split government between, you had a Republican president, a Republican Senate, and a Democratic House, it had to be bipartisan. And the theory of the Reagan administration, why they pushed for reconciliation to be used frequently during that period, was you ended up with one vote where there was some positive thing a member might be able to say about it, as opposed to all the individual items. You could claim, hey, if we pass this bill, it'll reduce the deficit by $300, $400 billion. And that was the impetus to try to put it all together into one package and say Congress is taking a very important step to reduce the deficit. You're never going to get deficit reduction of that magnitude if you try to pass a lot of little individual bills. They all get mired down in political controversy, and every committee wants to be budget neutral. And so that's really the main purpose of reconciliation.
So the budget, each of you have mentioned the debt targets. I'm all for that. I think that's, and I think it's policy neutral, Mr. Chairman, as to how you get at the outcome. But I think having a glide path to something more responsible, how do we put teeth into that to make sure that whatever the strategy, we walk it back to a responsible level? And I yield back.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. I was struck by Chairman Womack's opening statement regarding the disinterest that I think we all see in the budget resolution, and I think one of the reasons for that is that the question, the budget resolution, to what end, hasn't been answered. If the purpose is to create a reconciliation bill that is not even relevant to the fiscal task of the Budget Committee, which it has become recently, then it's hard to get too excited about that unless you're a proponent of the measure that is being driven through the reconciliation process. If you're doing budget resolution without a strategy or a timeline or a goal, it is hard to get excited about that as well, and I appreciate very much Mr. Capretta's focus on a target and getting there over time, because I think that's an important part of any serious budget fiscal process. It's also hard to get excited about a budget resolution where you don't even get the arithmetic right and add the elements that add to the deficit and the debt, which are revenue, appropriated spending, health spending, and tax spending. And if we're not looking at all of them, we're not even getting the arithmetic right. And finally, if the budget resolution doesn't help the appropriators get their 302s and it doesn't help solve the debt limit problem, again, hard to get too excited about it. So I think that gives us an array of tasks that can make the budget process meaningful again, and I want to particularly focus in my questioning on the debt ceiling, because I think you've all been really excellent on that subject. As Bill Dauster was kind enough to point out, I view this as a zero upside bear trap in the bedroom. Worst case scenario, you step in the damn thing, and bam, now you've got a hell of a problem on your hands. Best case scenario, you avoid it and nothing good has been accomplished. That's not a really good equation. Bill, you've looked at this for some time. You have a lot of experience in the Senate. Can you think of one good thing in your experience that was accomplished in the Senate by virtue of the debt ceiling? Some people say it's an opportunity to give the minority a chance to hold the majority's feet to the fire or demand something. Has that actually ever happened?
I am not going to be able to find that example. And in fact, I think that you're right about, and many of you have expressed the concern with the debt ceiling. We carry around in our pockets little pieces of paper like this that are basically just promises based on the promise that the government is going to do what it says it's going to do in the budget process.
Let the record reflect he's showing a dollar bill.
It could have been, though, a treasury bill, treasury bond. If we have pieces like a paper like that, we sell them for real money, real things of value in the world. But if we mess up the debt limit, then we have to pay people more in order to borrow from them by giving them little pieces of paper. So whenever we do debt limit crises, we put in danger the whole system that relies on little pieces of paper like this.
Let me ask you if you could get back to me in a response to a question for the record, because I don't think we have the time to really drill into this now. But as I think my House colleagues will be first to recognize, the Senate is a peculiar place. And
We'll stipulate that.
I think your idea about using the budget process to, quote, automatically change the debt limit, I think makes a lot of sense. But I think it would be helpful to us if you brought your experience in the Senate with its procedures and with its parliamentary rules and so forth to drill down through that automatically change concept and see what kind of language you might perhaps even run by the parliamentarian and see how we'd actually do that. I think that's a really good concept, and I think one of the things that makes the budget resolution relevant again is if it does move the debt limit so you don't have that bear trap waiting out there for you. But as you know, the Senate's in a peculiar place, and if you could drill through to that, that would be, I think, very valuable for all of us.
Happy to do so, sir.
And to go back to Mr. Capretta's statement, you talked about setting a target for debt and deficit reduction over time. My observation has been that the current budget process, at least in the Senate, doesn't do that. There's no point in that process we are asked to set what the target is, and I think every witness so far has agreed that the target is a debt to GDP ratio. Whatever the number is, that's the metric for it. And we're not asked that in the budget process at any point. And given that we're looking at $21 trillion, as Congressman Arrington said, we're not going to do that overnight, so there has to be a glide slope to get there. And presumably, there also have to be warning bells that let us know when we're off course. Is that the general concept that you had in mind about a target and over time?
It is, generally. I would support that as a way of doing the business. I'd also look at potentially present value calculation. That would be another way of bringing it down to one number that the public might be able to understand. Just have CBO.
Or do both.
You could do both.
So you can't game it so much.
Yeah, that's.
And does everybody agree that debt to GDP is the metric that we should be looking at in terms of
I would
functional
quibble
target?
on two grounds, if you'll forgive me. One is
I'm out of time, so keep it brief, Bill. Yield back.
you should be looking at the rate of change, not just the stock. So deficits are just as important. Where you're going is important, and why you're going is important. If you have a high debt to GDP ratio and you're fighting Hitler, that's okay. But if you're not doing something important, then it's not.
Mr. Sessions of Texas.
Looks like it's that one there. Thank you. I want to ask a different question. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, we went through in this body and in the Senate a process that essentially was CRs and essentially held discretionary spending flat. It produced a flat budget. It held government to making decisions, in my opinion, based on priorities. It refocused administration agencies, and it made them dig deep, in my opinion. It also caused, on the other side, some indecision about infrastructure decisions that we would make, and deferred lots of decisions. So some I think was good, some I think was deferred. What do you think, Ms. MacGuineas?
So I thought the purpose of the spending caps would have been most effective if what it had done was pushed lawmakers to replace them with more thoughtful, targeted changes to the budget that would have improved the fiscal situation. I thought the caps were the easiest thing to do because you don't have to specify what the savings are, and so it sounds like you're doing a lot of work, but you're not picking the policies. There was some savings that was smart, there was some savings that was excessive. Now that we've gotten rid of the caps, and what we should have done is when we busted through those caps, replaced them with savings elsewhere, we no longer have that spending constraint. But we also have the problem where discretionary spending, which really hadn't been the driving problem in the budget before, is about to be a big significant problem again. So I would pick reasonable spending caps along with pay-as-you-go rules. Reasonable meaning they're built from policies that you can stick to and you plan to stick to. But this time I would include the full part of the budget, not the part of the budget which at the time was the least of the drivers of the debt.
Yeah, a hungry person will gorge themselves. A person that eats consistently may be able to offer some bit of discipline in their eating.
That's right.
and
You
see
want
things.
budget constraint that is realistic. We want budgets that are realistic, and we want enforcement mechanisms that are realistic. And once we have things that on paper add up to huge aggressive claims that we're never going to get, the whole process becomes impossible to stick by, and then there's no credibility to it.
Mr. Capretta?
I think that the discretionary caps were useful for trying to drive a lot of productivity improvement in certain ways. I think they became counterproductive to some degree with respect to the defense budget. I think that there is pretty clear evidence that, you know, if you just look at defense over the 90s and then into where we are today, given the security questions going on, it seems like it's not going to work to have the levels that were there previously. And so something was going to have to give, and when you gave on that, you ended up giving on the other side as well. So that, I think, was the basic equation. Discretionary spending isn't necessarily the fundamental problem. There's lots of waste in it. It's very hard to target the waste. I think one idea that should be given more consideration is delegating to the agencies that are running these programs some more incentives to drive productivity improvements in their agencies so that they make the decisions to cut spending so that they can then spend the savings on bigger investments that they can find. So, you know, new models of running the agencies is probably a better answer than just blunt across-the-board cutting.
I'm not trying to give the answer for you, but I was out in Hawaii several years ago and met General Brown, United States Army, who spent a good bit of time trying to convince us that sequester was a difficult issue for the military. And I took 1 minute to suggest to him that I thought that the levels were fine. We needed to give it to him October the 1st instead of March the 20th. And he got his head around that. So I'm not saying that what the answer I expected from you, but I think timeliness is the most important aspect to run the government. Sir?
I agree with a lot of what you just said and what the other witnesses have said. Make it early so that the appropriators can react to it and the government can react to it. Make it rational and achievable, or else people will blow through it. But setting a cap is one of the best ways to get the agency to focus on achieving its savings.
I think no matter what the level is, time frame of efficiency, of giving the government time to effectively take whatever they are is important. Knowing we probably won't go back, but they've got, meaning how much money, we probably won't take back a lot of money, but giving them time to effectively do it. Sir?
If I may, there's a lot that could be said here, but I just want to emphasize that we should not assume that there's a lot of productivity that can be pulled out of all programs. It's not clear to me, for example, that the effect on the Social Security Administration of the kind of budget constraint it has faced is something that could have been solved by greater productivity. So I think we have to be very careful about making these assumptions in any part of the budget.
Oh, I think you could just look to the VA and you could, that'd be Exhibit A to me with the size. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Yarmouth of Kentucky.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all the witnesses. I've found the discussion very interesting, as all of our discussions have been interesting. I want to focus a little bit on the issue of long-term budgeting. It seems to me that 3 of the 4 witnesses have said we should be doing that, and Mr. White takes a contrary position. I remember several years ago when Tim Geithner was Secretary of the Treasury and he came before the committee, and Paul Ryan was then chairman and had all of these 40, 50-year projections of expenses and so forth and increasing the deficits. And I asked Secretary Geithner, you know, how realistic do you think 40 and 50-year projections are in a world that's changing as rapidly as this one is? And he said, I don't think projections outside of 5 years are worth anything. So would you elaborate, Mr. White, on what your opinion is on the perils of longer-term budgeting and what you think of maybe a realistic timeframe that's viable and
Sure.
meaningful?
Sure. It varies somewhat with the program, and you can do a better long-term focus for a pension program than you can for a healthcare program. Healthcare cost control is simply a year-to-year problem because the entitlement to healthcare is not simply to the beneficiaries. The reason our care is so expensive is we pay so much for everything we get. In other words, the providers are getting much more money here than in any other country, or the overhead expenses are much more than in any other country. And these are powerful, important people who, if you try to reduce their incomes, they will fight you. And you cannot budget in the long run to control the costs that the medical community will generate because there's just no policies that will do that. So healthcare cost control is a short-term problem, and I would urge, and it's a problem for the whole country, not just for the government. And we really need to do much better on that. And that is the most important thing we could do for the long run of the federal budget. If we got our healthcare costs down to something resembling the most expensive other country in the world, our long-term forecast would look a lot better. So one, there's some programs are different from other programs. Social Security is different from Medicare and Medicaid. Beyond that, I don't think you could, I think anything more than 2 years is probably a bad idea for discretionary spending because first of all, there's no good way to do the baseline. What is the baseline from which you start? The CBO baseline is usually, well, increased with inflation, but for some programs that may be that may be too much, but for a lot it's too little. The population grows, you're serving more people. And so I don't think there's any really good way to do long-term. And I think that the most important thing you could do about the long-term is get better control of the American healthcare system now.
You also, in your written testimony, talk about the point that budgeting should be more about just aggregate totals of spending and revenue. That has to be more about the policies that are reflected. And I totally agree with that. American people deserve to know what policies will underlie the allocations that we're making. And I remember so well Mick Mulvaney coming before the committee earlier this year, and he said, I could have come up with a balanced budget, but we would have been making stuff up. We would have been basically fabricating policy. And in prior Congresses, they've done the same. You arrive at a number, and then you say, well, details are to be determined. What kind of details, in terms of policies in the budget resolution, do you think are appropriate?
Well, I think that this obviously raises the question of which committees are going to make decisions about details. I think in the past, when reconciliation has been used to reduce the deficit, which hasn't happened for a while, but when it did, what actually happened was that the leaders of the committees, such as Senator Dole in particular, told the leadership of the Budget Committee and so on, hey, I think we can do this much. We have ideas about how we will do this much. I think it's in practice that there should be consultation with the leaders of the authorizing committees about what do you think you can do this year? How much can you do? No, we need more. And again, it's iterative. I don't think the budget resolution should specify the policy details. I think that the budget resolution, however, should be based on careful consultation about what details might work, and what totals might work. Finance Committee, what can you do here? Ways and Means, what can you do here? And the budget process can push. The Budget Committee can push, say, hey, how about some of this? But that's all before the resolution's adopted.
Thank you. I yield back.
Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. It has been, I agree with Congressman Arrington, this has been a very, very helpful discussion and debate this morning. I would like to start just by going back to having the budget as a joint resolution signed into law, and I know, Mr. White, you've expressed great concern there. It would be very difficult, but if the panel could go back and just maybe from your perspective, why would because a lot of our witnesses have brought this up in other meetings as well, but from your perspective, what would be a positive to having a joint resolution signed into law, and what might be the negatives of that same proposal? Jim, if you'd like to start.
Yes, back to the question, the recommendation I made in my testimony. First of all, the recommendation I made was just to make the budget resolution the vehicle for spinning off a piece of legislation that would go to the president that would amend the caps on discretionary spending. So it wouldn't be covering everything that would be going on in the budget resolution. I actually, in the past, have favored that. That may be a step too far for this committee to take. So let's just focus on the recommendation I had in my testimony today. If you put into the budget resolution the option that at the end of it, if it was approved by Congress, a separate bill would go to the president and he could sign or veto it, and it would change the caps on discretionary spending, this would get around the problem of a fake budget resolution. Because the resolution would be setting caps that, everybody would have to live with, okay? And these would be the real caps. They wouldn't be the fake caps with $40 billion in reductions that nobody planned to actually enact. So that's one very big positive, I think, that this would become a real vehicle for really setting the caps, and it would be the caps that the president would also have to live with. He wouldn't be signing on to anything else. Now, some people have said, well, the president why do we want to bring the president into the budget? The president's in the budget process. The president, at the end of the day, is going to be in agreement or in disagreement around the total amount of discretionary spending. They will weigh in on that one way or another before the process is out. If you can get agreement on that earlier in the year, you're better off than later. Now, I am not guaranteeing this would lead to agreement right away. This could mean, protracted negotiations like everything else. It could go on for months. But it would become a vehicle for trying to get that debate going. And by the way, if the president vetoed it, Congress would just go on like it already does. So you wouldn't really lose anything by doing this.
Yes, Joe.
If I may, Senator, but that raises a question. What is the period of the caps? If the period of the caps is say, 5 years, then next time it's time for a budget resolution, hey, we already have some caps. Right? We don't need to enact a resolution to have caps because we already have caps. So there might be an argument for, if you go to a biennial budget resolution, for having 2-year caps. But, and I think that would be responsible in terms of relating totals to details. But if the caps are for longer than that, then the argument that it's an incentive to pass budget resolutions no longer becomes true.
Very good. And Maya?
So I think it's a perfect example of how there are pros and cons in all of these policies, instead of that it's just one simple answer. And I think Doug Holtz-Aiken testified before in a way that made it really clear and helpful that the benefit of it is right now the budget doesn't have the force of law. It would be desirable if it did. It would be more meaningful, and it would strengthen the budget in guiding the entire process. The problem is how you feel about giving the president more power than he already has, because Congress should be able to take some of its power. And then I think the real issue is, where do you want those hard choices to come? Should they come at the beginning of the process, which they probably should, which is why I would, if I had to choose, go for a joint budget resolution, but it could make getting the process started much easier, and you want to have a backup plan so that if you can't come to an agreement, you can still have revenue and spending levels that you can move forward with.
Very good. I appreciate that. I've got less than a minute left, but I want to quick ask you, Ms. MacGuineas, about, you mentioned mandatory versus the discretionary spending and greater transparency, having a look at mandatory spending at some point during that budgetary cycle. How would you envision that?
Yeah, well, I absolutely think that you do need to budget in the longer term if you need to make projections and look at things in the longer term if you're going to make commitments for the longer term, which we do in programs like Social Security and Medicare. And there are a lot of important things that we need to be predicting going forward over the longer term, like things that are driven by demographics. So the first key is absolutely increased transparency. We have very good work on this from the trustees of Social Security and Medicare, but having other ways that we really put forth the projections that these plans are on. Then the next step would be coming up with actual, if your programs are out of alignment, if we're making promises that we aren't able to keep, which we are doing right now, there would be some action forcing mechanism where you would start to grapple with those. It would, as we've said throughout this hearing, be policy neutral. It has nothing to do with how you would fix these programs. It would be that we should no longer be able to abdicate the responsibility to look at programs where we are making promises without a plan for how to pay for them, and making changes to them sooner rather than later would be beneficial.
Thank you. I apologize, Chair. I yield back.
Ms. Roybal Allard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask a little bit different kind of question to see whether or not this fits into the equation as to what we are trying to do. You know, it's been mentioned that the congressional budgeting math doesn't match up with reality, that we should be looking at projecting, you know, outcomes further out to see what the impact is of our decisions, immediate decisions are, and how it impacts us in the future. And it was also mentioned that, you know, we better get better control of our healthcare system, because that's something that is also contributing to our, not deficits now, but and in the future. The thing I'm asking about is how we score things. For example, in terms of healthcare, the fact that we cannot score certain policies, and I'll use healthcare as an example. For example, prevention. When the information we get says that if we invest in prevention, for every dollar that is saved, we eventually will save, you know, $12, sometimes, you know, $24. I don't remember the exact number. And so, because it's not scorable, at least that's what we are told all the time, we are not able to, we become more of a, we do more treatment policy rather than prevention policy. And so, I guess my question is, in terms of scoring, is there anything that you think could be done in terms of scoring so that the savings that we could realize if we were able to invest more in prevention would become a reality? Because right now, every time we want to invest in prevention, we're told, no, we can't do this because it can't be scored, and it breaks the budget caps, or it goes, you know, beyond whatever restraints that we have. So my question is about the scoring. Is something can be done to include long-term savings?
If I may, there are two issues here, okay? One is the boundaries between discretionary and mandatory spending. So if you increase discretionary spending this year, the question is, that runs up against the caps on discretionary spending, and yet it's budgetarily sort of silly to let the cap stop you from doing that if it in fact will save you money on Medicare and Medicaid and so on down the road. And that would require some sort of changes in the rules so that so that mandatory savings as scored by CBO would be allowed as offsets against discretionary spending. You could do that by the rules, you know, within the caps. But there's a second issue, which is whether prevention actually saves money. And most of the time, CBO does not score prevention as saving money, because most of the time it actually doesn't. You know, the advocates will say it will, but finding data that actually supports that for most prevention measures turns out to be very difficult. And this goes back to Louise Russell's book 30 years ago on his Prevention Cheaper Than Cure. And prevention may in fact help. You may get healthier people from it, but it doesn't. Most of the time, CBO won't score it because they don't have the evidence to score it. So there's those two different issues.
Ms. MacGuineas, in your testimony, you say that Social Security deserves a place in the budget process. And as you know, anytime we mention doing anything with Social Security, it raises a lot of red flags for a lot of different reasons. So can you please elaborate a little bit on how you think Social Security should fit into the budget process, and how could we avoid some of the pitfalls that so many see whenever we even talk about Social Security in any way?
Yeah, let me first agree and empathize that having a discussion, a national discussion about Social Security is incredibly difficult because it becomes demagogued immediately, and you quickly move away from what the actuaries tell us to sort of threats of people trying to harm seniors or do this and that. And that's about a national discussion. We're not having very good national discussions on a lot of things right now, and we need to change that tone and that tenor in the way that we talk about things. And that's why I do believe things like the trustees of Social Security, CBO, impartial arbiters are really critical in all of these discussions. The reason I think Social Security needs to be a part of the budget, and again, policy neutral. We can fix Social Security all by revenue increases. We can fix it all by spending reductions. We can do it with a combination. It's not about how you fix it. It's that we have made promises that we are unable to pay right now. So we do want to think about that. But it's also the point that budgets are about resources and how we're going to allocate them. And it's really important that at some step, and that step should be the budget, we look at all of our resources in total, how they're allocated in the budget pie, and ask ourselves the question, does that reflect our national priorities? And in most cases, I'm sure it probably will, and that's a good thing. But we should not take pieces, big pieces of the budget off and say we're not going to look at them, because budgets can't look at the whole picture unless you understand all our tax dollars, where they're going, what the trade-offs are. So this is everything with Social Security is controversial, but this shouldn't be. This is just a basic principle of how one should budget. And again, it has nothing to do with outcomes, but we should fix the program. It has nothing to do with directing how we should.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Ms. MacGuineas. Everything with Social Security is controversial, but I suspect, now that more than half of the Congress got here when I did in 2011 or more recently, not a one of us has been asked a question about the 1983 Social Security amendments. Not a one of us has been grilled over the increase in payroll taxes. Not a one of us has been grilled about the reduction in benefits. To Mr. Capretta's point, we did something that was going to take place 30 years later. We phased it in over a large period of time, and we all knew that born in 1970, I'm not going to get my Social Security benefits until 67 instead of 65. And I am vexed about how, to Mr. Dauster's point, how we get folks to focus that far out on the horizon. But I know it would require a reconstitution of the budget committee process. I would, so many state legislatures, the budget committee, the appropriations committee, same committee, and so I understand some of the recommendations for getting the president involved. Today, it actually is pretty clear to me that we are performing three separate functions. I'm doing aspirational goals in a budget to tell my bosses back home what I would do if only I were king for a day, which I'm not. Then I do an authorization process to say, just so you know, we can all work together, and these are all the things we would do for you if we had the money to do it, which we don't. And then I come along once a year and say, this is actually what I'm going to fund, but don't forget about the really good authorizations I did for you and the really good budget that I passed for you earlier. And so I don't think we can reject that political reality that those things play a role. So I want to focus on appropriations because that is where the rubber meets the road every year. And I have a letter from the CBO where they talked about how the FY 2017 appropriations were being spent. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put this in the record.
Without objection.
What the CBO was asked is, what's that spend rate? Because we really do want to hold folks accountable. I think it was Mr. Dauster who said this is the only way I can get the administration to come back and visit with Congress day in and day out. And what the CBO found in this report, and I apologize if my colleagues don't have a copy of it, is that about half the money did go out in year one, but the other half of the money went out in year two or year three, or had absolutely no time limit on it whatsoever, just went out whenever. So my question for each of you in the 2.5 minutes I have left is, knowing that the spend rate is different, that folks are spending annual appropriations over many years out into the future, and knowing that number is actually 50% of the money that's going out, not in year one, does it change your expectation of what keeps the administration coming back to Congress? I want to stipulate that Article 1 is who I want to protect. Could I really move to biennial or triennial or some different cycle given the spend rates that we see in appropriations today? Mr. Dauster?
I think that's an argument for annually appropriating, because then you go back and you see, are you spending it where it needs to go? And if you aren't, then you can grab some of it back and use it in somewhere else.
Now, I can only grab it back if I have an appropriate president who's willing to work with me on a rescissions bill. And if I have a president who's willing to work with me on a rescissions bill, then I don't need the club of appropriations to get the agency to come back and visit with me, is my expectation. So I'm thinking this is an adversarial situation that it comes up most often. Mr. White?
Well, I think what we're talking about here at some level is the difference between budget authority and outlays. And so when Graham-Rudman was passed, which focused on outlays, they had to have this massive negotiation among CBO and OMB staff to come up with spend-out rates for every program, project, and activity. Because if you're going to buy an aircraft carrier, it's going to take a very long time to spend the money for an aircraft carrier. And if you're going to build a road, again, you don't spend all the money on the road that year. On the other hand, there are things for which you spend money immediately, or it's sent out this year for next year, like support for education. And so most of what's going on in this situation is just the natural differences among types of programs. And I don't think that will really have much effect.
Well, from an
on what-
accountability
on your- on what you
perspective,
want.
my experience with the Department of the Navy is they're very interested in what I have to say when we're talking about buying that aircraft carrier. Once we have half an aircraft carrier, they're pretty sure we're going to get that second half down the road. The military contractors are pretty sure they're going to get that second half too. So I know we're all worried about what happens with the appropriations cycle. I'm just not an appropriator, trying to understand how that mechanics work.
Well, I think that they're worried about getting the budget authority in the first place, and if they get the budget authority for the aircraft carrier, then and they screw it up, then maybe there's a possibility you won't give them another aircraft carrier.
I see my time's expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Kilmer.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks to all of you for being with us. There's a lot of conversation about carrots and sticks, and Mr. Dauster, I wanted to get a sense from you regarding what sort of positive incentives could be put in place to encourage bipartisanship and sound budgeting. You raised the notion of a fast track, and I'm not entirely clear what that looks like. I guess I can see how you could create an incentive in the Senate to act in a bipartisan way if it gets around vote-a-rama and filibusters and all that. But why would a majority in the House be incentivized to go that route when they can do whatever they want with 218 votes?
I should say that I pray every morning for humility, and sometimes it takes, so I should say that I'm not an expert on House procedures, and I shouldn't pretend to be. I want to agree, though, with what you said in an earlier hearing, that often when Congress puts a gun to its head, it pulls the trigger.
For sure.
And so if you're putting in sticks in the progress, you want to make sure that you're willing to accept those sticks. So I'm much more of a carrot person. And I think that from a Senate perspective, the particular carrot that works best is to create an opportunity for a fast track where you're able to move something quicker with fewer amendments and get it done. And the cost for that is often you need a supermajority in the committee or a deadline to produce it before X date in order to get the right to use that fast track.
If you or others have thoughts about how you could get a House to buy into that approach, I'd value, because we've been trying to think about what carrots might look like. You've spent a lot of time working on these issues, and I know one of the reasons that you're as vocal on this is that I don't think Congress is going to do anything on this issue unless the American public demands it. And to me, that's part of the appeal of the fiscal state of the nation idea, to try to drive some conversation around budget deficits and our nation's debt. Can you talk about how you see that having some potential value?
Yeah, I really do. And one of the things that I really like about something like the fiscal state of the nation is that it's not hard to do. There's nothing that's hard about it, but it could start this positive process, because I agree with you, nothing is going to change unless you all go home and feel like your voters actually want you to make some of these hard choices, and that has to be a stronger sentiment that they enjoy you giving away lots of things, not paying for them, and fighting with each other. But the public will not make that change on their own. That will ultimately only come from political leadership. And so we've got a little bit of a catch-22. I think the best thing to do is give people information, give you all, the political leaders and the president, information, and insist that it be shared in a way that this is the effect of our budget. Another idea I was thinking about when I was listening to you all talk is at the end of the budget cycle, we should actually look back and see how much you stuck with your budget and how that played out. But the biggest piece of it is sharing the information in terms of the longer-term issues, what we're facing, what the effects it would have from our political leaders, and then that will create an understanding. It's just, CBO, all you have to do is read a CBO document and understand how real this is. But finding a way to share that with voters who are dealing with a lot of things that affect their lives personally will help them be able to support the hard choices that you know you need to make but are hard to make.
You also put in your testimony, you called out the value of establishing the discretionary spending allocations earlier in the process. I tend to agree with that because until there's agreement on the 302As, the appropriations process is kind of churn without real progress. So can you talk about, maybe elaborate a little bit about why you think that could help reduce some of the friction in the budget process?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to end crisis budgeting. Right now, things only get done when there are action-forcing moments, and those things are almost always suboptimal. So you want to put a way in the process where we know that we're not going to have shutdowns, where these things will move more smoothly. But also, they're attached to some of the bigger choices. So what you want to do, I think, on the appropriations part is find a way where you know you can set the numbers that appropriators will be able to start doing their work, but not as an excuse not to do the full budget. For instance, right now, when we have 2-year budgets in place, you hear people already saying, well, we don't need to do a budget. We don't want that to be the outcome. So back to the trade-offs like there are with joint resolutions. You want to get those numbers on early, and people can make their decisions so that we're not doing the last-minute budgeting, which really leads to poor outcomes. We have many examples of that recently. But we don't want it to be an excuse to drop the rest of the budget process.
Right. Thanks, Chairman. It looks like I'm out of time. I yield back.
Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the testifiers. Great conversation so far. First, a comment about the purpose of this committee on a bipartisan basis. The problem that we are here to try to solve is CRs, shutdowns, debt ceiling, a lack of the regular order on the budget and appropriations process. The problem we are not here to solve is long-term solvency of the Social Security Trust Fund, Medicare, Medicaid. That is for another day, and that is sort of outside of our ability to put, I mean, remember that the statute that enables this committee is supposed to provide something to both houses for an up or down vote by the end of the calendar year. And so although all of those conversations are interesting, and I'm tempted to engage with you, Ms. MacGuineas, about Social Security, I will resist that temptation. But that illustrates my point, that we want to make sure that we calibrate our ambitions so that what we do is what is possible this year. And we don't have an academic discussion that either goes completely sideways by the end of the year or ends up becoming a partisan conversation. We can achieve, if all this committee did was get us on a path towards the regular order, maybe by eliminating the debt ceiling as a weapon, maybe by rationalizing the budget process, that would be a tremendous accomplishment. We don't have to fix the country at this table in the next 6 months. We should just get ourselves on a path to do so. So along those lines, I'm going to talk about some small things, or what I think are small things. The 74 Budget Act provides that the president is required to submit a budget the first Monday in February, and then 6 weeks later, the committees are requested to submit their views, and then the Budget Committee is supposed to act by April 15th. I guess my question is, at least as long as I remember paying attention to politics in this town, we always ignore or reject the president's budget. And to the degree and extent that this committee is literally about asserting our Article I authorities, our constitutional prerogatives, I guess I'm just wondering why we need a president's budget at all. So it's in certainly direct contradiction from your proposal, which would actually elevate and make meaningful the pres budge, and then we have to make our own, and then it's subject to a signature or veto. My view is, if what we really think is the executive proposes and the legislative disposes, why don't we just go ahead and move quicker and take out that one step? Because I think from a timing standpoint, in addition to aligning the fiscal and the calendar year, those are just kind of some minor tweaks that would allow us to sort of get to business right away, and I'll just go down the line.
Okay, so I would say, by all means, the process should start earlier. There's nothing wrong with changing the calendar. There are some good things to be said for the president's budget. One is that it's important to understand from the executive branch the statement of values. And two, there's a lot of good policy work that goes into it. So if you read the fine print, there's a lot of ideas you can pull out and use that's very helpful. But I think recognizing that the beginning of the real process is Congress's budget makes sense.
Okay, that's fair, that's fair. So we can still have a process, but there's no
You don't
reason
need to wait.
there's no reason to start the clock only upon
I would
receiving
agree
the
with
press
that,
button.
right.
Okay, Mr. Capretta, go ahead and disagree with me.
Well, that's okay. I think the president's budget, first of all, a longer-term perspective would show that president's budgets have had in past times, depending on the political circumstances, a lot of influence. So, 1981 was not 2018, okay? And neither was 1993 or 1997. So sometimes in our history, president's budgets have been very consequential. So I'd be careful about just saying we don't need this. I'd also agree with the point that there's lots of detail that's very important. The appropriators would never agree to get rid of the president's budget because that information is chock full of detailed information about what's really going on at the account level that they need to then write the appropriation bills.
Right, but maybe I'm serious, maybe we don't need to call it a budget if it's really not a budget and it's not the basis for our budget.
Well, a lot of people would disagree that it's not a budget. But anyway, yeah, I think it depends on the circumstances.
Mr. Dauster.
I want to bring my recollection of working at the end of the Clinton administration in the White House. And the budget was a useful document to get the rest of the government to pay attention to what the president wanted to be done. The OMB has to organize the government to be reactive to the administration's priorities, and for that purpose alone, it's a very useful thing. And I agree with what was said earlier as well.
Well, I think first of all, remember the basic problem is to relate details to totals. And so long as the president doesn't have too many magic asterisks, the president's budget does create a template that does sort of do that, and that you can then work off of in other directions. I think that, again, so long as OMB actually has enough staff and isn't doing all sorts of other stuff, it provides a review, a scrubbing of the estimates, which is also useful to the appropriators. Somebody once told me that the National Cancer Institute direct pass-through budget is totally useless because it's too big and you don't know what to do with it. So the presidential scrub is useful on appropriations. The president's budget gives a template, if he doesn't lie too much, about fitting totals to details. And the last thing the president's budget does is it gives an ability to pass on blame. So if the president proposes something and it's unpopular, but you sort of want to do it anyway, you say, hey, it's his idea. And if the president proposes something and it's unpopular and you don't want to do it, then you say, okay, we're going to go cut something else, and the people we cut will be really angry at us, but then we have the people we saved from the mean old president's budget. So the president's budget is partly about blame allocation and serves some useful purposes for Congress in that.
I don't think we need another mechanism for blame allocation.
No, avoidance,
Yield back.
blame avoidance.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Rono is on her way back from a vote, so we're going to hold this hearing open for a few more minutes, waiting on her re-arrival. I do have a question, though, and while we're waiting on her, if anybody else has a question, we'll take those as we can. There's been a lot of discussion about the appropriations piece of this whole process. I have a theory, and I'm an appropriator, that once we do appropriations work, once we have 302As and suballocations and we actually complete our appropriations process, the appropriation committees, certainly the subcommittees, are finished. They don't do a lot more. At least that's been my experience. Would an appropriations process that would scan longer than an annual process open up the opportunity for more and better oversight? Anybody?
I think some of your best oversights when they have to come in and talk to you about the budget, though. If they don't have to worry about the budget or about being funded, they're going to be less concerned with the oversight.
Yeah, I guess the question is if they have some time to do more work, and this is, obviously most of the work, is done by the staff, right? And then it's just it's like being a student, right? There's these really heavy periods, and then there's these slower periods, and they, unlike you, don't have to go back and talk to the public, and so they have some time which could be used studying and learning more about the agencies. In theory, I'm not sure biennial appropriations would just get less attention, And I don't think it would give, extra time that would really be helpful. Is my perception from the years I've spent looking at the Appropriations Committee. But, really that's more of sort of the members' judgment as to what could be better accomplished.
Mr. Capretta?
Yeah, I think that it's possible that not spending so much time on appropriations could free up more time for the Congress to do other things in various ways, not just the Appropriations Subcommittee. I think the real question is that Congress, I think, needs to spend a lot more time doing oversight work of mandatory spending too, frankly. That there's lots of detail going on in the mandatory spending side where the money's going out the door without any annual appropriation, where a little more scrutiny would be helpful. There, some of these programs have a big label on it, and there's 15 things going on below the surface. And not a lot of members of Congress, I think, understand that. And so looking at military pensions and all the things that go on with that, looking at the entitlements in the Veterans Affairs area, looking at even Social Security, and then, of course, Medicare and Medicaid. They're big programs. They're spending, literally hundreds of billions of dollars. More and more oversight of what's really going on in those programs, I think, is most useful.
Maya?
Yeah, I agree with Jim's point in terms of where the oversight is most lacking. There's actually a lot of good evaluation that goes on of a lot of our discretionary programs. It's not worked into the budget process probably as much as it should be. But where I think we need to be spending more time is both on oversight of the big mandatory programs and also thinking, and this is again why I think the long term is so important, thinking about not just where our resources should be right now, but where they're going to need to be. And when I look at the world in the next 10, 15 years, the one thing I'm pretty certain of is we don't understand how our economy is going to look with the future of work, with technology, with AI. These things are changing dramatically. And somewhere in the budget process, you also want to be really working in the time and space and thought for evaluating how we want our budget to help the whole country move forward. So there's a lot of things we need to use extra time for more of, and I would focus on some of these big thorny issues and evaluation of the big programs.
Senator Hirono, welcome back.
Thank you very much for holding this meeting open, and I want to thank all of you. As we sit here, be honest with me, all of you, whatever we come up with, unless there's a political will to do it, is for naught, right? So that's the thing. I mean, to me, I would like to lay out some parameters so that we have something to shoot for. It's sort of like the Constitution, there's ideals exemplified in the Constitution. One hopes that we can work toward those ideals, but I just don't know what it's going to take for the political will to actually abide by whatever we come up with. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't make an attempt. So I do have a question for you, Mr. Dauster. You've been around for quite a while, and you've been through a myriad debates about drafting of and living with budget process reform legislation. And I think you said that you're more of a carrot person than a stick person. So of all of the various processes and reforms that you've seen enacted during your time on the Hill, which were the most effective in your view, and what made them effective?
Thank you, Senator. And I agree with your general introduction. You want to try and do the best possible, but no more. The one that I enjoyed the most, or I thought was the best change, was in 1990. We were coming out of a fixed deficit target regime under Graham-Rudman, and we changed that to a cap and pay-go system where you make the people who do the deed responsible for what they do. And so I think that was the direction of change that makes the most sense. Make your process punish the people who do the thing that went wrong, don't punish everybody.
I think that the pay-go system, which we try to abide by. I mean, that's one that we usually try to come up with. How we're going to pay for whatever changes we're making. Now, I think Ms. MacGuineas and maybe some of the others of you talked about how transparency is really important, and that we don't really spend a lot of time especially educating the public, much less members of Congress. But we do have many more opportunities to find out, what the ramifications of our processes are and our appropriations, et cetera. But where does the public understanding of all of this comes into play, and what role could conveying more information to the public play in informing the kinds of actions that Congress takes?
I do think it's critical, and we've talked a bit about the fiscal state of the nation or other approaches like that, which I'm a big supporter of. I think it's more critical now than it's ever been, because frankly, when you talk about budget process and all the different terms that you all are familiar with, they are not just meaningless to the public, they are alienating. And it is just another example of kind of a language where Congress is using something where your constituents don't understand what you're talking about. And I think it leads to the frustration and just, throwing your hands up with Washington. I don't even understand what they're talking about, and it makes me feel not a part of the process. So I think transparency is really important. I also think simplifying the process in ways that it can be conveyed to people is really important. And to your first point, I think everybody agrees, I know I certainly agree, that there are a lot of aspirational things that you want to do on this committee, but the best things that have worked in the past is when members of different parties and different bodies have gotten together and come up with something. So again, I'll kind of end with where I started, which is getting something done is one of the key things. And if you take a small step here, it can really lead to something.
So I think, I agree that getting members of both parties to buy in, maybe one of the ways structurally we can encourage that is for the members for the chairs and the ranking of the authorizing committees to be members of the budget committee, because that's not what happens now. Anybody want to respond to that?
I definitely think that makes sense. Senators Inouye and Kassebaum were advocates of that back in the day, and it would get more buy-in. The only problem is you have members of the Budget Committee right now who view their membership as a thing of value, and so that's why I'd argue as openings come up.
I don't know, have you talked to Senator Whitehouse?
Some of them, as openings come up, and there may be more openings, give the other chairs a first right of refusal to join in and sort of move to a place where you have the chairs and rankers, all the members.
I think it's important not to, there's two different things being talked about here, right? One is what would make the budget process itself get better attention and so on, and more buy-in. And the other is what to do about the process of changing the budget process. And I think that quite possibly making up the budget committee from chairs of other committees might make sense. But I don't think anything is going to really get the public's attention in a positive way. I think people are always blaming public distrust of government on whatever it is about the government that they don't like. And whether the public actually cares about any of this stuff, or many members of the public, seems quite questionable to me. And for transparency to matter, people have to be willing to look. And we can try to propagandize the public by coming up with a statement about our fiscal future, but somebody's going to write that statement. And whoever writes that statement, there might be some arguments about the way they write that statement. So I'd like to provide much more information. I'm not sure I would disagree with CBO writing a statement, maybe. But I really think that, at least for current purposes, focusing on what could be done about the budget processes would do a little bit of good this year, sort of along Senator Schatz's lines. That would feel nice to have something nice happen.
Well, if we can automatically increase the debt ceiling, that would be a very positive thing as far as I'm concerned. But this is why the fiscal state of the union may be a really good way to educate. And, I don't expect the public to understand what's going on, et cetera, but at least you give them a tool that they could look at, not to mention all of us, and I think my time is up, so thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Ms. MacGuineas, Mr. Capretta, Mr. Dauster, Mr. White, thank you for appearing before this committee. Very interesting discussion that we've had today. I'd like to advise members that they can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any member who wishes to submit a question or any extraneous material for the record may do so within 7 days. I think it should be noted that our ability to sit in here today and have the conversations that we are having, those privileges are secured by the hardships and the sacrifices made by people that we will recognize on Monday, Memorial Day. It is my hope as chairman of this committee, co-chair of this committee, that each and every one of you have a great Memorial Day weekend and reflect on the sacrifices made by the men and women who give us this outstanding privilege. And with that, this hearing is concluded.